persons with intellectual disabilities on inclusive education. Today, we are very happy that persons from more than 28 countries have registered for our webinar. People from Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Mexico, the States, Canada, Iceland, Ireland, just to name a few. Well, to make it short, we are very glad that people from around the globe are participating in our webinar today. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Tobias Buchner. I am head of the Department of Inclusive Education at the University of Education Upper Austria, which is in Austria. And I am also the chair of the Special Interest Research Group on Inclusive Education of IESID, the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. This webinar was organized by my dear colleague, Deirdre Corby from Dublin City University, who is the secretary and treasurer of our CERC, and by myself. Deirdre will introduce you to the practicalities of the webinar later on. Furthermore, this webinar would not be possible, and thank you for that, without the support of IESID Academy. Before Deirdre will explain the practicalities of our webinar, let me shortly introduce you to our topic. Our topic today is of high relevance due to several reasons. First, and in general, persons with intellectual disabilities have been silenced. Their voices have remained unheard or rather ignored in research traditionally. And this exclusion from research is still taking place, as we have argued in a recent article. This exclusion is linked to a certain history. When we take a look at the history on research in relation to persons with intellectual disabilities, one must say that research has been, and all too often still is, research about rather than with persons with intellectual disabilities. Several barriers to participation have been constructed, mirroring ableist discourses around interviewing persons with intellectual disabilities, for example. Persons with intellectual disabilities have been considered as being not able to express or rather tell their own experiences. They were positioned as unreliable informants, as it was termed in old school deficit-oriented research language. These barriers were stabilized by deficit-oriented assumptions, and lots of articles were written about the phenomena of what has been called acquiescence of persons with intellectual disabilities. But for a long time, nobody asked how the interview situation, or more broadly, how research could be designed in a way that enables persons with intellectual disabilities to participate. However, with the advent of the self-advocacy movement, these ableist assumptions and practices in research have been challenged. Thus, more and more scholars tried to include persons with intellectual disabilities in research, such as pioneers like Dorothy Atkinson, Jan Wormsley, and Kelly Johnson, who developed approaches that have been termed as inclusive research. Thus, a lot has changed concerning the voices of persons with intellectual disabilities in research. Also in our field, inclusive education, there is a certain tendency to include the voices of students in research. However, persons with intellectual disabilities are, in comparison to students with other impairments, still rather often excluded from research in this area. These are the reasons why we planned a webinar on the topic, and we are very glad to have researchers from different parts of the world who will present their research and tell us how persons with intellectual disabilities were included in their studies on inclusive education. Before we come to this, Deirdre will introduce you to the practicalities of the webinar.
Okay, folks, you're all very welcome. I just want to let you know that the webinar will be recorded, and after each presentation, there will be some time for questions. Please use the chat option in Zoom to submit your questions, and I will put them together and try and reduce them down to a couple of questions to each presenter. The chat will be monitored, like I said, and everybody that attends the webinar will receive a certificate after the webinar once you've registered correctly through IACID. Just in relation to the second presentation, which will be in Spanish, if you want to listen to it in English, you click the button that says interpretation at the end of your screen and select the option English. The webinar is automatically in English, but if you want to listen to it, select the English option. If you don't see the interpretation, press the 3 dots that will offer you the option. If you have any difficulties at all, please put a question in chat and we will sort it out for you. I'm just going to hand you back to Tobias now to introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Deirdre. Yes, we are very glad to have different presenters from different parts of the world and from different academic stages. Our first presentation will be facilitated by Dr. Cristiana Azanteva Oquiera. Dr. Oquiera is a postdoctoral research fellow at Michigan State University. Her research interests focus on quality of life for children and youth with disabilities and their families globally. Currently, she is involved in the implementation of several community-based participatory research projects to improve the career development and employment outcomes for transition-aged youth with intellectual disabilities. Dr. Oquiera is a Mandela Washington Fellow, awarded by the government of the United States for her contribution to improving the quality of life of individuals with intellectual disabilities and their families in African contexts. She has partnered with several institutions in Ghana to recognize exceptional college students for leadership and excellence awards and provide voluntary services and support, including speech therapy and day-to-day care for children and youth with IDD in Ghana. We are very glad to have you here today, Cristiana, and your presentation will be about the experiences of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and I'm looking forward to your speech very much.
Well, thank you so much for the really nice introduction. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining this nice webinar. My name is Cristiana again. I'm not going to go too much into myself because Tobias already introduced me. So my name is Cristiana and I'm currently a postdoc at Michigan State University. The title of my presentation is The Experiences of Children with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities in Ghana. So going forward in this presentation, I'm going to use the acronym IDD to refer to intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I just wanted to know that. Okay. So in today's presentation, I'll give a little bit of a background, just a brief background. I'm going to talk about the context of the study. I'm not sure if there are any people watching from Ghana or if anybody has any experience going to Ghana or if anybody has heard of Ghana, but I'll just say a little bit about Ghana. I'll briefly touch on some theoretical underpinnings for this study, and then I'll jump into what really children shared with me, their voices. And that's what I know all of us are interested in hearing. And then some, steps for future directions. What can we do? So yeah, this is just a little bit background. So I just wanted all of us here to know that the Republic of Ghana, has inclusive education policies. And these policies say that children with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities can participate in inclusive settings, like inclusive classrooms. But what do we normally see? What we see is that most of these children are excluded, from inclusive settings. And on the research front also, we realized that most of the studies, especially in African contexts, have focused more on children with visual impairments, children with physical disabilities, excluding children with IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so I thought, okay, nobody has really done anything like this. So it is time for us to actually engage with these children and listen to what they have to say about their experiences in inclusive schools. So this is the study context. I already mentioned Ghana. So the first map you see right here is the map of Ghana. The big one right here is the map of Ghana. Ghana is situated on the west coast of Africa. If you've never been to Ghana before, I'm just giving you a brief about Ghana. So it's situated on the west coast of Africa with an estimated population of 25 million people. Now, 3% of these people constitute persons with disabilities, okay? And Ghana has 16 regions or states. So in the US, the regions will be equivalent to states. Okay, so we see all these regions up here. There's the Upper West, there's Ashanti region, there's the Greater Accra region, actually, which is the capital of Ghana, the Greater Accra region. And so what I did is I conducted my research in that region. So it's just one of the 16 regions you see here. And the Greater Accra region is the largest and it is the capital. And you see on the second picture you see on my screen here is the map of the Greater Accra region. Now the Greater Accra region also has 16 districts. Okay, so when you bring it into a United States context, that would be like municipalities. So the Greater Accra region has 16 districts, and I conducted my research in one of these 16 districts. Now, this district is called the Ga East District. And somebody would ask, okay, why did you decide to pick this district? So I decided to pick this district because it has the majority of schools that say are practicing inclusive education. At least they say that they are practicing inclusive education. And that's why I chose to, focus my study on specific schools in this district. So here is the theory that guided my study. Briefly, this is the Bronfenbrenner's bioecological system framework. And I know since most of you are into inclusive education, you'll be so familiar with this framework. So this framework basically theorizes that various immediate factors and distant factors. So you see all of these factors, there's the microsystem, there's the mesosystem, exosystem, macrosystem, chronosystem. Now, all of these factors affect the development of the child at the biosystemic level. So you see the child right here. Now, when you bring this into an inclusive education perspective, you realize that all of these factors, the life transitions, the health systems, the family members, the peers, they contribute to really how inclusive education is implemented in different classrooms across Ghana, and I mean across every part of the world. So this is the Bronfenbrenner bioecological framework. I just used it to guide my study. I used it to kind of guide the kind of questions I have. And during data analysis too, I used it to, kind of structure my findings. So before I actually delve into the study, I just wanted to say that this study is just one study that is coming out of a larger study that actually sought to understand how inclusive education is implemented in Ghana. So the first part of the study was a systematic review, or as some people say, scoping review. And based on the gap I found in this scoping review, I decided to conduct a second study that focused on the voices of children with IDD. And based on what these children told me, I needed some clarifications here and there. And so I decided to again talk to their teachers to understand really what is going on in the classroom. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing on study 2 that sought to really understand children's experiences. And the overall goal of the larger study was to improve quality of life, quality inclusive education implementation for children with IDD. So yeah, this is the study. Like I said, it's already published in the African Journal of Disability. So if you wanted to read more about it, you can go to that journal and find it right there. And the main goal of this study was to understand the experiences of children with IDD in inclusive schools in Accra, Ghana. So now let's delve into it. So these are the methods I use. You can see me here in a school setting talking to children. So I use the qualitative descriptive design, and I sampled 16 children with mild to moderate IDD. So if you're not really familiar with the qualitative, you'll be like, oh, 16 is not a lot, but 16 is a lot. And especially when you're dealing with children with, IDD. And I used purposive sampling. I sampled children from 4 schools. I had 8 females, 8 males, and they were within the age bracket of 9 to 16 years old. Now, because number 1, I was dealing with children, number 2, children who also have IDD, I decided to use 3 methods of data collection. So the first thing I did was to observe. So you see right here, observations. I used another technique. It's called the draw and write technique. And then I used interviews. The reason why I did all this was to help me triangulate across the data to really understand children. Because I came across some students who were not really vocal. I mean, most of them were not that vocal. And so I needed to use all of these methods. And I use thematic analysis by Brown and Clark. I'm sure everybody knows thematic analysis. Okay. So what did I find? What are the main findings I found here? So I found 3 themes. Like when I analyzed the data, 3 themes emerged across 3 aspects of Bronfenbrenner's bioecological framework. So the first theme here is on the individual characteristics of the child. And in this team, like I presented more of participants' knowledge and views of themselves in comparison with their peers without disabilities. And I also covered comments on their personal characteristics. So I had 2 sub-themes emerge here. Now, the first sub-theme is behavioral challenges of the child, and the second sub-theme focused on their learning challenges. So you realize that I put some sample quotes here. Please hold on. I'm not able to really see my screen well. Okay. Okay. 1 second. So yeah, so the first one focused on behavioral challenges. And here, I told you already that I did some observations. So after observations is when I actually conducted interviews. So under this sub-theme, I noticed that some children were sleeping in the class. Some children would look outside the classroom windows. Some children would cry and make noise while their teacher is still teaching. And for children who were sleeping, for example, we have one quote from Lily, a 10-year-old girl. She said, "When I am tired, I sleep in the class when teacher is teaching. So I don't do my work. Or sometimes I will do my work after teacher finished teaching." And this is true because I also observed this Lily child sleep. Not just Lily, but there were other children who were sleeping while the teacher was teaching. And like I said earlier, some children were also looking outside the classroom windows. And Danny here, another 10-year-old, said, "I like it when my teacher gives me work in school, but when teacher is talking, it is difficult to listen and understand. So I look in the window and watch the people playing." So I realized from these conversations with students that even though they were interested in what was going on in the class, they would still look outside the window or still sleep because they did not understand what their teacher was teaching. And then some children also I observed were engaged in like fights. They would fight with their friends. So one child, Kofi, that's 11-year-old, he said, "I beat her because she took my pen." Of course, he had a reason, right? He said, "I beat her because she took my pen. She said she will give it to me and she put it there and somebody stole it. I told her to give me my pen, but she did not." So I asked this child, I observed this child fight with her friend. And that's why in interviews, I asked this child, okay, so Kofi, why were you fighting with your friend? And this is the explanation Kofi gave. And we will understand this as I move forward, why children with IDD would engage in fights. Sometimes it was their fault. Most of the time it wasn't. So number two, this sub-theme number two is learning challenges. And here, many students talked about how they really wanted to learn. They were interested in what their teachers were teaching, but they just did not understand. And this very powerful quote from Pearl, a 13-year-old girl, would give you more insight about what was happening in the classroom. So Pearl said, Madam, and Madam means teacher. In the Ghanaian context, when a child says my Madam, it means Madam is teacher. So Madam gives me work, but I can't do it. I'm never able to finish my work. I like English, but when she asks me to read, I am not able to read. When she says I should spell, I can't spell. I don't understand math at all. I can understand it, but when it gets to exams, I do not understand, and it worries me, right? And we see right here, Pearl is saying that it worries her. So it's not by choice that she does not understand, but she just did not understand what the teacher was teaching. And this shows a big curriculum issue going on right here. And I found it interesting that some children also acknowledge that they were different from their peers. I found that really interesting because I thought some of them did not know they had disabilities. But hear what Ivan, a 16-year-old boy, said to me. He said, as for the learning, it's different from everyone and what they know. So the little I know, I also do it. So we are all different. I am not intelligent, but I can write some of the work. I am now learning small things. In exams, I don't do well. I see the thing, but don't know how to write it. And I pause here because I want you to think more about what Ivan is saying, to even for these children to know that they are indeed different from their peers. And some of them also told me that they really enjoyed their school settings and they wished that they could get someone to really help them to fit into the inclusive classroom, to understand what the teacher was teaching. And listen to what Kevin, an 11-year-old boy, told me. He said, I think this school is good for me. No, I don't want to go to another school. I want to be here, but I want my teacher to help me with spelling and reading and writing. If teacher helps me, I can be able to understand and write. I like this school. I just want someone to always help me to learn. So this is an appeal by this 11-year-old Kevin, telling me that I want to be here. I want my teacher to help me. So this is the first theme here. Now moving on to the second theme. Okay. Okay. Okay, so moving on to the second theme right here. The second theme focused more on interactional patterns that were occurring in the inclusive classroom. And when you cast your mind back to Bronfenbrenner's bioecological framework, this falls under the microsystems. And I already talked about how all the factors, distant and immediate, contribute to the experiences of the child in the inclusive classroom. So we have, I identified two sub-themes here. The first one is on teacher interactions with the child with IDD, and the second is on peer interactions. Now, before interviews, I observed that teachers focused more on students who had no disability. Okay, and it was just natural also for students who had no disability to keep raising their hands, and so it was easier for the teachers to call them. But I realized the teachers did not engage with students with IDD at all. And listen to what Ida, a 13-year-old child, said. She said, Madam does not call me to answer any question because I do not know the answer and I do not raise my hand. So Madam calls my friends to answer the question. So they know what they're going through and they understand what is going on in the classroom. But again, they seem content because, I mean, that is their world. Okay, and teacher was not calling them. And I also observed this and noticed how true it is. And then I also noticed that in terms of teacher interactions, anytime teachers even try to interact with children with IDD, it kind of focused more on corporal punishment. So you realize teachers spanking children with IDD, and of course they were spanking all the other children. So somebody would say, well, they were spanking all the other children, and they were spanking children with IDD also for not being able to answer questions the few times they were asked to maybe say anything or, submit their homework or something like that. And let's hear what Kwame, a 14-year-old boy, said. He said, when I'm not able to answer questions, Madam will spank me. Or when someone answers, Madam will say, the boy who got the answer correct should take the cane and spank the people who are standing. And so when I am standing, Madam will let the boy spank me. And this is one interesting thing I noticed. Sometimes it seemed like the teachers were kind of tired of the talking and the screaming and the spanking, so they would ask their children who got the answers correct to spank those who did not get the answers correct. And I just wanted to throw it in here that in the beginning, I had some challenges because I was in the classroom and observed what was going on. The teachers were not behaving like themselves, but as I spent time on the field and stayed there for months, they forgot that I was in the classroom. So they were behaving the way they would behave if I weren't there. I just wanted to throw in that here. So now peer interactions, there were two things happening here. Sometimes I observed that children who had no IDD and children who had IDD were good friends, kind of interacting with each other. I saw that children without IDD would help their peers with IDD with classwork. I observed all of that. Sometimes when it was break time, they would go outside together or also get outside watching them. They would be playing football or playing some other Ghanaian games on the field. So one boy, Eric, he told me, a 14-year-old, he said, we love each other. If I am holding something, I will give my friends. And if they are also holding something, they will give me. I do my work with my friends when I come to school. I learn with my friends. We play ball together. And at break time, we run on the park and then we go home together at closing time. So you see that bond here. And again, what I observed, children helping each other. On the flip side, and I was wondering if this is just something with children. On the flip side, you see children also abusing their peers with IDD. And I saw it myself, and sometimes I wondered if the teachers had seen it. And I had one student tell me, I asked her, so when you are verbally abused by your peers, what does your teacher say? And I remember the girl telling me, well, she doesn't say anything, or she would say, I should just go and sit down. Hear what Ida, a 13-year-old girl, told me. She said, they insult me. They are in the class. They beat me. They don't like me at all. They see that I am dirty and I don't like dressing. They said my face is like someone who do not speak well. They can insult me that I don't know anything. They open their mouth to say things that does not make me happy in the class. So even though love is going on here and there, majority of students with IDD told me that they felt abused. You see, so strong corporal punishment going on in the class and peer victimization as well. So this is theme number 2. Now the last theme here is environmental characteristics, and this is a really strong one. What was happening here? We had 2 sub themes. So the first one is the school environment. Okay, what was going on in the school environment? And the second one is the home environment. So I realized here that in terms of the school environment, and I think I touched on it a bit in the earlier slides, the curriculum. Children were using the same curriculum. Children with IDD were using the same curriculum as children without IDD. And as we can see from all the themes, they did not understand the taught lessons. So it needed to be modified, and talking to teachers after, I noticed that, yes, the curriculum needs to be modified, but they didn't have time to modify it at all. So please hear what Eric, a 14-year-old, told me. He said, "Madam, give us the same work to do. Sometimes we look on the board, and sometimes we look in our class 3 writing textbook, but our work is the same." So they were doing the same work. And I also noticed, so there are about 60 students in one classroom. And in that classroom, you have about maybe five children with IDD. So it was really easy for teachers to forget that they even existed. And in terms of sitting arrangement, interestingly, students with IDD sat at the back of the class. So let's say there are about 10 rows. You see students with IDD on the 7th, on the 8th, or the 9th row. So one child told me, Eric, he said, "My teacher said I should sit on these seats when I come to school every day. And so I sit with my friends here because it is my seat. In my school, everyone has their seat." This is me trying to understand why they sat on the ninth row rather than the first 3 rows, okay? Now, when we move it to the home environment, children with IDD lamented, many of them lamented about how they had no support in the house. For example, even with homework. So here again, a 13-year-old child said, "I do not get anyone to help me with homework at home. So I do it myself, and teacher will say the answer is wrong. And sometimes I do not do it. I bring the homework back to teacher." And in my other study, talking to teachers, teachers were just angry that students will come back to school and no single person can help them with their homework. And then other children told me some of the challenges they faced at home in terms of household chores. So they said that once they get home, they have so many things to do. And so they get back to the school environment really, really tired. And hear what Rose, a 14-year-old girl, told me. She said, "When we are learning, my mind doesn't go to the board. I think about the house because when I go home, I will fetch water and wash bowls. And if I finish, I will go and sell. So I cannot do my homework." So you realize here what is going on in the school environment, the issue with the curriculum not being modified at all. Now in the home environment, there's no support. And then the children are also burdened with household chores, which actually affects the way that they would have performed in the inclusive classroom. So yeah, in terms of the major findings, like I said, we have inclusive education policies in Ghana. We have them, we have the policies, we have the legislation. I think the difference here, the difference between developing contexts like Ghana and other contexts like the United States is a big gap between policy and practice. So there are no watchdogs monitoring and evaluation to actually ensure that whatever provision is in the policy or in the legislation for children with IDD in inclusive classrooms are implemented. And when I talk to teachers in my other study, they even complained about how supervisors will come into the inclusive classroom and will not even ask about children with IDD. They do not even ask about them at all. So teachers felt that if they invested more in these children, they were wasting their time because nobody would even ask them anyway. And it was not contributing to their performance anyway. So we see that huge gap between policy and practice here. And another big thing we found here in this study is the access to supportive resources and services. Okay, so teachers were not modifying the curriculum, and that was a big barrier. And in my study with teachers themselves, I realized that they did not know what to do themselves. They needed somebody to be able to train them. And we realized also in this study that there was lack of collaborative partnership between key stakeholders. So the family system in the home doing their own thing, the teachers also doing their own thing, the children in the classroom also doing their own thing. So there's no collaborative partnership like you see in developed contexts sometimes. And then the huge huge problem of peer victimization and corporal punishment. I know that in different contexts around the globe, corporal punishment is banned. It's banned. It's not even in schools at all. Well, the Ghana policy says it's banned, but again, the gap between policy and practice, is it banned or is it really banned? No, who is monitoring this to ensure that children are not victimized or they don't undergo, corporal punishment? So all of these things I found just show that, there's indeed social vulnerability in the inclusive classroom. And so we need to find a way to protect these children. And in contexts like Ghana, I think what can really help is the monitoring and evaluation, like having people who be checking on these students and having people who be helping teachers themselves, because most of these teachers, they did not even know what they were about. And then trying to identify ways in which policy environments can be more accessible for students with IDD. And I already touched about collaborative partnerships. So we have collaborative partnerships with parents, if teachers, if governments are working together, then children can have better experiences in these classrooms. And I realized that families may also have their own challenges. So it may be good to just try to conduct a study with families and listen to their perspectives as well, why they are not able to support their children in inclusive schools. This will be the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be able to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Christiana, for that very comprehensive presentation. There's been lots and lots of questions, and I'm just going to try and summarize them. A lot of people were asking about parents and what their involvement was in your study. Have you any comments on that?
Yeah, I do. I have. So for my study, because it came from my PhD and I had just 3 months in the field, I wasn't able to engage with parents, but informally, I engaged with some parents who would come into the school to check on their parents. And this, I engaged with just about two parents. And some of them shared that they did not know what to do, okay? Most of them also, the issue of poverty and lack of education. And we see this across the inclusive education literature, and especially in African context. So some of them, they don't even understand what type of disability their children had. Some of them just thought their children were being stubborn. They did not understand. So realize here that, and that's why I talk about collaborative partnerships, that it's important for teachers and families to work together to try to engage more with the families. And I have planned to engage with families as well. But for this study, I did not actually collect data from family members. So it's just kind of informal. Yeah.
Okay, Christiana, just because of the time, I'm just going to ask one other kind of broad question. A couple of people have been asking about the type of training the teachers had within the schools for supporting students with disability.
So we have two types of teachers in the classroom that I engage with, the general educators and the special educators. So in an entire school district, having about, let's say 6 schools in one district, there were only 2 special educators assigned, okay, to about 6 schools in one district. And these special educators would move from one class to the other. So it may take them about 3 months to get to school classroom B, or classroom D, or classroom C. But the general educators were more spread across all of these classrooms, but their education, their training did not entail, special education. They just spent about maybe 1 semester learning about, let's say, what is disability, that kind of basic thing. So that isn't the focus of their education. So they are ignorant about really what goes on. So ideally, there should be 1 special educator, 1 general educator, each in 1 classroom. But because of scarce resources, there are only 2. And that really compounded the issues. Yeah.
Okay, Christiana, listen, thank you so much. We're going to hand back to Tobias, but if you have some publications down the road, we would like to make them available on the IACID website. So we'll talk to you about that again. Thank you very, very much. And I'm going to hand back to Tobias to introduce our next presenter.
Wow, what a fascinating presentation. Thank you, Christiana. Our next presentation will be facilitated by Cristina Nieto Carmona. Cristina studied pedagogy at University of Seville from 2009 to 2013. Since then, she completed 2 postgraduate math masters, 1 master in teacher education for secondary schools and 1 in special educational needs. At the moment, Christina is finishing her PhD thesis, which aims to identify the barriers and aids that people with intellectual disabilities have had throughout their lives. She also works as a teacher at eLearner, a higher education center in Spain. I'm already very excited because Christina is going to talk today about her inclusive research project with a specific topic which is about the experiences of students and if they prefer special or mainstream settings. Christina, I'm looking forward to your presentation very much, which will be translated.
Okay, just to remind people, if you want to hear this presentation in English, you must press the button at the end of your screen. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be here today. Cristina Nieto is my name, and I'm going to talk about basing in an article that was recently published. Next slide, please. This article is just part of my research, the research for my thesis. I'm going to introduce it, then I will talk about the research questions, the objective, and the method. And finally, I will tell you about the results and the conclusions. Next slide, please. We have based our research on previous publications, mainly recently published studies which identify barriers to inclusion for people with intellectual disabilities. There are similar research in other countries. We have shown what is the best way to include intellectually disabled students and how normal, conventional mainstream schools is the best way to include them. In Spain, people with this can attend normal mainstream schools. They can attend a combination of special school and resource room, and ordinary is a combination of both, and then special schools. Next slide, please. The study that I'm presenting to you today has the objective of contributing to the debate on how different educational environments can facilitate inclusion or exclusion of people with intellectual disabilities. We based our research on 3 questions. First, do mainstream schools facilitate or hinder the learning of people with intellectual disabilities? 2, do people with intellectual disabilities prefer mainstream schools or resource rooms, pardon? And 3, are special schools barriers or facilitators? Next slide, please. This research is a qualitative research and is based in some inclusive investigation research. People with disabilities have an active role as co-investigators, co-researchers in the study itself. People with disabilities and myself together, we chose the topic, we designed the interviews, and we analyzed the interviews. I, on my own, I interviewed the participants, wrote the interviews, and drafted the conclusions. We carried out the study with 36 participants. It was intentional sampling. That was the way we reached the result. There were adult male or female with intellectual disability willing to participate in the study voluntarily. The whole process was parallel because participants belong to 2 different occupational centers. So the same activities that took place in one center took place in the other center as well. So 2 areas, 2 spaces where we researched parallel. Next slide, please. So two different groups, two different centers. Next slide, please. During the first session, we explained the objective of the research and we invited them to participate and cooperate. It was a brainstorming session about topics that they themselves would like to research. They picked to talk about their preference for what kind of education they want, their relationship with the teachers and with their peers. So the co-researchers chose the topic that we were to research. During the same session, we wrote down on the whiteboard what questions they wanted to ask in order to obtain the information about these topics. The only thing I did as a researcher on my own was to collect all the different questions from both centers and eliminate those questions that were repeated. Once they decided to participate, we signed an agreement, a consent. I carried out the individual interviews and I transcribed them. We gave them the transcriptions in case they wanted to change and edit anything. If any participant had problems reading it, their colleagues or myself would help them. Once we had all the data, we analyzed the information in a joint session with all the participants. Next slide, please. Before analyzing the data, I edited the transcription so that they were totally accessible to them. During the interview, we used questions that were complex and they might be too difficult for them to understand, for each of the participants to understand, because they have different levels of language wealth. So we have the examples here. I removed all the personal data of all the participants so that the interviews would be totally anonymous. Those sentences that were complex from a syntacsis of grammar point of view, I changed them and made them simpler. I replaced difficult technical words by simpler words. For example, curriculum adaptation is something that everyone would understand, for example. And I deleted repeated ideas. In the first session, next slide please, we defined the objective of the investigation, the phases and the participants. In the next sessions, I gave randomly to each participant an anonymous transcription and I asked them to read it individually themselves. Afterwards, as you can see on the screen, we put a poster on the wall with two clear points. On the one hand, we had mainstream schools. In the other one, we had special schools. Within mainstream schools, we had two groups, regular classes and resource rooms. I selected one of the categories. I explained to the participants what it meant and I gave them examples. Afterwards, I asked the participants to look in the interviews the passages that would go under that specific category. Once they found a passage, we will read it out loud, we will discuss it, and we will stick it on the wall under a particular section that it was related to whether it was a mainstream school, or regular classes, or whatever, until all of the interviews and all the passages were categorized. Afterwards, we summarized all of the conversation, we recorded the session, and then afterwards, on my own, I drafted the results. Next slide, please. So results, mainstream schools, are they facilitators or are they obstacles? those who attended resource room were in favor because their learning was adapted to their needs and because there's no discrimination in the resource room. Those who are against it, they said that separating students due to according to their disability, it is a form of discrimination. Mainstream school can also offer the same benefits without the need of separating the students. Also, they said that the opinion of the students were never taken into account as regards what kind of school they wanted to attend or whether they wanted to be in the mainstream school or resource room. The participants who were never in a resource room, they wanted to attend it because they didn't like the mainstream school because their needs were not catered for and because there is discrimination there from their peers. Others were against the resource room because in the mainstream school, teachers would adapt their teaching to the students, and because they would get good respect and from their peers. Next slide, please. As regards special schools, some participants who had attended mainstream schools were in favor of special schools because in mainstream schools they felt were not that learning was and teaching was not adapted to their need and they suffered discrimination from their peers. Others said that they were against special schools because it was a way of excluding them and because differences are not normalized in special schools. Most of the participants who attended mainstream school, special schools all of their lives, they said they would prefer to study in mainstream schools. And finally, participants who who started in mainstream school and then moved to special schools, they said they prefer special schools because they would adapt to their needs and because they didn't feel their peers discriminated against them. Next slide, please. Conclusions. Most of the participants would give us information. They spoke about the positive and negative experiences in mainstream schools. There was a generalized feeling of being excluded, however. In spite of that, most of them preferred to study in mainstream schools. And there is students who have attended mainstream schools but separated in resource rooms. So that is not inclusion, and they could because they could participate with their colleagues. Barriers come because the curriculum is not adapted to their needs, but also it comes from their peers because they discriminate against them. Participants especially criticize their educational experience with teachers because they are the key for including students with intellectual disabilities. Teachers have to celebrate diversity. They must contribute to prevent stereotype setting. They have tackle any segregation. They have to include students. And they have the point of connection between the school, teachers, family, and students without disabilities. Teaching have to be reviewed, the curriculum has to be reviewed, and participants said that when the teacher and colleagues contribute to inclusion, people with intellectual disability feel value and they feel loved and they feel like they belong to the group. Those who participate in the study said that the resource room is an alternative method to support them in order to compensate for the obstacles they find in mainstream school and to feel safe from discrimination. They mention also the special teacher because they are motivating and empathic. But there's a danger with segregated rooms in mainstream schools because they are false inclusive contexts, false inclusive environments. Most of the participants consider special schools as a total way of excluding them, even though they had positive experiences in them. They prioritize the existence of a school in which they all learn together. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be delighted to reply to any of your questions.
Thank you very much. That was another very interesting presentation. Again, there's a couple of questions for you. So I suppose the first question here that's a bit different than the previous questions was somebody's asking, are there any assessments before a child goes into a special class or mainstream setting in Spain?
Sí, se hace una evaluación.
Yes, there is an assessment, a psychopedagogical assessment by the psychologist of the center and by the teachers team.
Okay. And the other question that people are asking, again, similar to the previous one, how much involvement do the family members have, or do families have in these decisions or in the schools?
Las familias participan, pero la
Families
decisión
participate, but the final decision is always in the hands of the teacher and the psychopedagogical team in the school.
Okay, and finally, there was somebody was asking in the chat, how much did you feel the children enjoyed the participatory element of the study?
Tengo que decir que no son niños, son adultos.
They're not children, they're adults. And I think they did, because one of the benefits of inclusive research is that for the first time, or very rarely, they are asked about their opinion. So they feel empowered. They're very much motivated. They want to end discrimination, and they want to be able to contribute towards the future and future generations. So I think they enjoyed it. I was there, I was present, and I could see it, I could feel it. I also felt it in the way the comments they made. Like, for example, they would say, when are we going to do another research? When can we participate again? When can we be part of the research team? They wanted more.
Okay, and just thank you. And just the last question is, what do you think the mood in Spain is like in general? Are people more inclined to send their children to a special or mainstream school?
Hay opiniones divididas. Recientemente,
The opinions are divided. There is a law recently passed in which we're going to try and close special schools in as much as possible. We're going to try and make them part of the mainstream schools. And there are divided opinions about this. There are people who feel that the best way to educate people with intellectual disabilities is outside the mainstream school. We've had people demonstrating in the street lately as well to avoid closing the schools. And those who are protesting are the families of these children. So the families themselves are against including students with intellectual disabilities in the mainstream schools.
Thank you very, very much for that presentation. And I've just noted there that Tobias has put a copy of your paper in the chat, and really interesting paper. I'd encourage everybody to read it. And once again, thank you, and thank you to the translator. And I'm going to hand you back to Tobias to introduce our final speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
gracias.
Yes, our final presentation will be facilitated by Dr. Geraldine Scanlon. Geraldine is an assistant professor in psychology and education in the School of Human Development and is the faculty ethics advisor for the Institute of Education at Dublin City University. Her areas of expertise have enabled her to collaborate professionally at both national and international levels. Her research interests have been concerned with strategies which support the inclusion of children with special educational needs in mainstream education and the implications for teachers and schools in facilitating those needs in light of inclusion. A key feature of her research has been transitions for this group of pupils moving from primary to post-primary school, further and higher education. Geraldine, I'm looking forward to your presentation very much. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I just let me get myself started here. It's lovely to be here today and lovely to see some familiar names from across Europe because we won't get to see each other this year. So a big shout out to everybody there and also colleagues from Ireland. So I'm going to present this study to you now. This study was funded by the Irish Research Council, really interesting type of scheme where they allow academics to team up with an NGO, so a non-government organisation. And in this instance, I teamed up with a group that, would you believe, I had volunteered with in school many years ago, but had still in the area that I was born. But they have gone from strength to strength and developed a huge amount of different types of supports for working with adults, and then had moved into working with children with disabilities. So I'll take you through. When we think of the purpose of education, the whole notion is really here, what should be to expand all young people's resources to cope with the actual and anticipated demands of their lives. That includes readiness to thrive at university or college, in the workplace, and much more besides. So when we think of this much more besides piece, these are the soft skills that we need to acquire in order to navigate our daily lives. Also, what informed this study was a human rights perspective, particularly from the perspective of the child. I'm sure you're all familiar with Article 23, so I'm not going to go to it in detail, but particularly when we look at the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, which states that all necessary measures should be taken to ensure the full enjoyment by children with disabilities of all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with other children, and that the best interests of the child should be a primary consideration. So in this regard, this study is very much framed within a human rights perspectives, as well as the rights to education. Not only the right to education, but also the right to participate and to be included in society. So as a result of that, that brings us to this whole notion of citizenship. And this whole relationship between participation and education is not a new phenomena, but it's certainly been driven by the human rights perspective. And really what we see here is that how the state actually carves out the relationship for each individual in relation to how they will aspire to and how they will actually maintain their levels of citizenship. In particular, what we see this, I suppose, related to is the whole notion around the specific rights and duties, including the right to earn a living, which is very much echoed in the CRPD. So when we think of that, really what we're looking at here is participation, because we know that by participating in society, which is what citizens should be doing, it accords, I suppose, all of us our right to autonomy and a choice around the policies that affect our lives, because we vote. You know, we live in a democracy. We let our voice be heard. In relation to that then, within the Irish context, and these were the considerations for this study, when we look at participation rates of children with disabilities, but more, I suppose, really young people with intellectual disabilities, what we see here is that, and similar to the Spanish model, we have segregated settings. We continue to have either mainstream or special. There's no in between. Interestingly, what we see here is that at second level, so young people with disabilities who actually go on to second level, this is generally 13.7% in comparison to 4.2% of their peers. Then we look at the transition to third level. And what we see here is that only 37% of young people with disabilities make the transition to third level in comparison to 53.4% of their peers. Employment rates then, what do these look like? Well, interestingly, again, employment rates with disabilities, we have quite a poor record in Europe in this regard, is 49.7% in comparison to 82.3%. But interestingly, people with an intellectual disability experience the lowest levels of employment at 17.3%. And these are the most updated figures. Quite sadly, I feel, which is really the reason, I suppose, that I got involved in this study, is that traditionally young people with intellectual disabilities who leave special schools go into funded day services with no choice with no choice at all as to where they go. They're just told they have to go into day services. So from that perspective, immediately this is leading to, you know, social inclusion, but more importantly, participation in their community, because in many cases these day services are not based in their community. So what we see here then is that there is little or no formal transition taking place to support people with disabilities moving from education and training to employment. That was some research there that we conducted in 2015. So when we think about this then, this brings me into the whole notion of transition. And really interestingly, at the time that the funding was announced, the government had developed the Comprehensive Employment Strategy for People with Disabilities. And this was developed to address historical barriers to employment, which was arising from inadequate education and skills, low levels of expectations, and the loss of disability payments. To put that in context, when you are 16 in Ireland and you are on the disability register, you get what is called a disability payment. And you'll see later when I'm reporting on the findings and the stories of what occurred in the research, is that this disability payment can actually be a barrier for full participation. Other considerations within the transition context, we know that little or no formal transition planning takes place to support people with disabilities who are moving from education and training to employment in Ireland. More so, we also know that this process is really fragmented when young people are moving from compulsory education to further and higher education or employment. This is well documented, as you well know, within the literature, despite their aspirations being similar to that of their peers. These young people have exactly the same dreams and aspirations as their peers have. This is particularly important at the point of transition from school to further and higher education or directly into the labour market. So when we think about transitions in general, you know, we're looking from preschool to primary to post-primary and to further and higher education. But in Ireland, once you come out of the educational system, you then move into the health service system. And with a disability, even that transition can be extremely fragmented and troublesome for many parents. So let's look at what we know, what we see to be transitions. When we look at a normative transition, now I'm not saying that in particular, I'm well embedded in the transition literature, but generally, you know, people go from school to further education or higher education. They can go from school onto employment if you're in a mainstream school, or, you know, you can take a couple of different routes. But what we see here is a very different picture, in particular because young people who are leaving special schools, actually the curriculum is not the same as it would be in mainstream schools. So these young people are only coming out at level 3. And in order to move within a framework of qualifications, if they want to move onto the next level within the European framework of qualifications, they must have a particular level of qualification to get there. Now, this becomes even more fragmented depending on where you live in Ireland. So what you're seeing there is that an awful lot of our young people actually just go into adult services and transition into employment. as opposed to actually having the same opportunities that their peers would have in mainstream schools. This is not much different, let me tell you, for people with young people with disabilities in mainstream schools, because the levels of support and guidance can be quite poor, and again, depending on where you are in the country. So this leads us then into the walk peer model. So the structure of the research really, as I said, brought me into contact with this organisation who was actually engaging with young people in special schools in order to help them to make that transition. And more importantly, was really informed by the human rights perspective, in that these young people were perfectly entitled to have the same choices and opportunities as their peers in mainstream schools. What you're seeing there in front of you now is the overview of what the walk peer model is and what the comprehensive employment strategies, which has strategic priorities, has. And what I've done here is that I have mapped the walk peer model onto the actual policy document and initiatives. That's, well, a lot of it is on hold at the moment with COVID, but in general we had been moving quite well. I want to draw your attention there to action 5.1, which is the year 3 in transition, and in particular the comprehensive employment strategy brings our attention to this notion of transition, and importantly, a seamless transition that enables young people to move forward. Again, what you can see here is that the people from Walk Peer engage with the children in the school quite early on. So this is well documented in the transition literature, that we should not be waiting until actually that they start school, that they're leaving school. They actually are engaging with them in first year. But what you see there also is the type of things that they do. Year 1, they engage with them. They ask them a great question. What do you want to be? What do you want to do when you leave school? Then they work with them around the progress. They make that transition. They support them through their development, and most importantly, it's sustainable. And this is building on the priorities, as you can see underneath, which the comprehensive employment strategy would say: we're building skills and capacity independent, we're providing bridges of support, we're making work pay, and we're promoting job retention. Very critical for this model is that this young person is supported by a wonderful person called the Career Employment Facilitator. And these people act as the trusted adult, and they mentor this young people. They explore their aspirations. What do you want to be? How? So, for example, you know, one young man would say, I want to be a pilot. Okay, you want to be a pilot. Well, what do we need to do to make you a pilot? And in actual fact, that young man ended up working in the airport. So that was where that's where that aspiration moved to. What they also do, though, is they raise the expectation in the sense of, and not only of the young person, but also of the family. And they say, you know, you can do this. You're well able to do this. And they get them work experience. They develop that pathway. We know again within the literature that work experience is critical to positive outcomes for all young people, not only for young people with intellectual disabilities. But if I'm in a segregated setting and I'm not being given the opportunity for work experience, then how am I going to develop those soft skills? So that's what they do. And importantly, they develop sustainability. What you can then see here is that it is actually keying in, it's actually supporting 3 really, really important principles. That is access, choice, and citizenship, which is key for, you know, our whole notion of social inclusion and participation. So what was the purpose of this research? Well, we wanted to examine the concept of supported transition that I've just given you in a very quick overview. We wanted to inform the development of a national framework of transition, and I'm very happy to say that we have done that. We're at the table with the policy people to document and identify the critical elements within the Irish context. Now, in particular, that's really, really challenging because not an awful lot of the departments talk to each other, but hopefully that will change. But this is really important with regards to developing this system of seamless support. And then to explore the effectiveness of what is actually happening now, in order to include young people with disabilities who are entering mainstream further education and higher education in the labour market. So, sorry, just let me go back here. So this piece of research was supported by an ethics as process method. We spent an awful lot of time getting to know the young people themselves. We included the parents, we included the school staff, and of course we included the people who work for Walk Peer. We had great fun with the young people themselves. We attended a couple of different ceremonies that they were participating in, and we went to their school concerts, and we very much we wanted them to build up some trust with them as well. What we did was that we had two different schools. We had a senior class 1 and senior class 2, and then we had in one school, and we had senior class 1 and 2 in the second school, and we also had some school leavers who had left in 2016. So what we were trying to do here really was just we interviewed the students by themselves, which was fantastic. Obviously there was an adult nearby, but we really had good fun with them, and I have to express that I really enjoyed working in this research with them, and they were quite willing to talk to us. And for those children who weren't willing to talk to us, their parents act as a proxy for them. But today I am just reporting on the students' experiences. When we talk about research with young people with intellectual disabilities, it is about placing them at the centre of their experiences, and I hope you'll see that captured in the comments that are made by the young people themselves. So really what we were concerned about is what aspirations are expressed by young people with intellectual disabilities. And these are the type of questions that we asked them. When you were young, what did you want to do in your life? What did you want to be? What are your career ambitions or future aspirations? And if you could choose to do anything after you left school, what would that be? What did the results look like? Well, as you can see, we had quite a number of themes emerged. As a result of that, then we condensed that into 5 further themes, which then we resulted in barriers and facilitators. Today, I'm not going to look at barriers and facilitators, and I am just going to look at 3 of the themes in particular, because this is particularly where the young person's voice permeated the final analysis. So the first aspect of this is the dreams and aspirations. And when we think about dreams of aspirations, really, for many young people, the strengths and interests provided a foundation for building their future hopes and ambitions. So the facilitator built on those dreams that they had already. The current strengths really provided a foundation for building the future hopes. For example, one young person said, the whole dress design, I love it. As I got older, you know, I just moved more into fashion and drawing and my art. I want to do clothes designs. Like I know how to do a bit of embroidery and knitting and so on, and the whole lot. Like I practice these things at home in different colors and in the seasons and that. I'd like to have my own clothes range someday. Isn't that fantastic? This young person wanted to have her own clothes label. This self-awareness then was married with a growing sense of self-determination. We know that's very critical for developing these skills. This also meant that early ambitions were part of a complex plan that had long been in the planning. So again, embedding ourselves within the transition literature, knowing that it is really important to start this early. Believe it or not, my dream job is to become a game designer. I was about 11 when I thought of it, because I always wanted to see how it's done. What you need to do. I want to literally put my head down and study for this game design, because this is actually my dream job. Early interests were also developed and progressed over a 2-year period. When I got into college, Nuri, it is City and Guilds Diploma 2 in Crookery. I'll be the only one in the house going to college. That was a great sense of achievement for this young person. What I have embedded throughout the presentation, I won't get time to go into them in detail for you, are the stories, and you can read that for yourself at a later stage. The next aspect then was post-school options and pathways. Really, when we look at this, this is really related to the knowledge and understanding of the range of post-school pathways and options, which are a fundamental factor in planning for school transitions. Many students demonstrated certainty about how they envisaged their life after school. For example, I'm going to college in October. I've applied for that as well as over the last few weeks. Employment-based training in the National Learning in the Ramparts QQ Level 4, because my mum told me she doesn't want me staying at home anymore. Gaming as a job or a career? Well, it would be, but I don't think so, no. We'd have a long way to go. Ultimately, I don't think it could happen. It'll be a good dream, but I don't think it'll ever happen. It's competitive, but he's still thinking about it. And here, the point of view of a young person without any employment prospects. You'd end up being stuck at home for the rest of your life doing nothing, unless you have a parent that works on something that could help you get a job. Other students had more of a clear understanding of the product offered at the adult services. So this was where I said at the very beginning of my presentation that these young people were transitioned into adult services. Oh, service, I'm definitely not going there. As far as I know, it is people with really bad disabilities. They do kind of childish things, but I don't want to be doing that. For other students, information was vague and insufficient to support them in making the decisions about post-school futures. Yes, I went to the service. It's a place where most people, kind of disability people go. Drama, art and all that. Most what primary infants do. You're doing the same thing all the time, like what primary school do, like junior kids doing it. It's like a routine all the time. And I think what's really important here is that they were beginning to actually reject the model that had been traditionally offered to them through the HSE. You go to a service and there's not, I've heard, I can't say anything is probably true, but I know they do a bit of work experience, not a lot, that's all I know. Again, another story there for you to delve into in your own time. Access to information, we know, for all of us as human beings is critical, and students were aware of the range of further education and training options that were available for them and how these were facilitated by the supported transition programme, but they weren't always clear about what the pathway would look like. And in particular, this is articulated here by a young person, and the interviewer says, then as soon as you finish those, courses that you've talked about there, can you apply for a job in a creche when you finish the EBT and then you finish your course in URI? And the young person says, I'd say so, I'm not quite so sure. Young people also alluded to the information provided by the HSE, which implied that essentially there isn't no choice. This I found to be the most difficult part of this research with regards to these young people, because they were so capable and so willing to become engaged in whatever it was they needed to do to progress. This young person said, I thought there was no support or anything like that, Like when I told your one from the HSE, as I said before, she just came in and she just started telling me, I have to go to this place or else nowhere. So I just kind of took it into my head, but sure, I really can't go anywhere except there, you know what I mean. Students were keenly aware that walk careers and employment facilitators had communicated the information about the alternative pathways that they may not have received. I probably would have ended up on a course like the one your one wanted me to go to. It's the same as EPT, etc. But really, it's important here is that this young person wasn't necessarily accepting what the access to information did, because she knew that she had choices. Again, another story there of a young person's journey. The last aspect of this now then is expectations. And this factor emerged as the most significant of the themes and principally referenced attitudes, stereotyping and the limited expectations of society and how these might impact on employment, I suppose, opportunities from all other voices, but particularly when we look at what the younger people started to say. And this was really quite lovely, I thought, because the younger students who were not going to progress for a while talked about the supported transition programme and talked about access to equal opportunities and rights. It didn't really help that, like, I just noticed people were getting a lot more opportunities than special needs schools would. Basically, you think like back 10 or 11 years ago, anyone with a disability or a form of special needs would end up on a rundown job, like working as a janitor or something like cleaning, like in a restaurant or someplace, etc. I just want to get to, I won't finish that off because I'm conscious of time. But particularly here, what we're noticing is that for those approaching the end of their school career, stress and anxiety also crept in, despite of all the groundwork that the WALK programme had done, and the fragility of tentative and uncertain plans for the future cast a shadow over expectations. Yeah, sure, the HSE was forcing. They weren't forcing, but they were telling my mum that this is the only option and all this kind of stuff. And then they rang my mum last week and saying, we will pay for you to go there. So what you're seeing here now is coercion. Coercion from the services to encourage parents to keep their children in the services which are state-run. Again, another journey there for you to have a look at. So moving on to the conclusion here. What we're looking at now is it really the framework of WALK Peer and how it facilitated what the components that we think are really, really important. Not only that we think that, but that we know are really, really important for young people to make a transition. The findings demonstrated a strong correlation between the support programs and the transition planning, which are critical if young people, or indeed any young person with disabilities, are to realise their goals and succeed, because they're being given access to information and they're making an informed choice about their future, not letting everybody else make those choices about it. This really showed how it translated into the realization of their goals and successes, and portrayed concrete examples of strategies and key people who facilitated the transition and transition planning. The career employment facilitator is key to this model. Engaging in the supported transition programme provided young people with access to information, options, confidence, some of the hard and soft skills as a result of their work experience, which were required for successful transition into education and employment contexts, even though those pathways are long and circuitous. Hence, it will take a while for me to get to the top of the mountain, but this young person was very adamant that they would get there. So in conclusion, when we look at the whole notion of the supported transition model, it is embedded within the principles of the United Nations rights for persons with disabilities, in particular around participation. It brings the young person to a place that they can make an informed choice about their own lives, about their future. This needs to be informed and supported by strategic priority 5.1 in the Comprehensive Employment Strategy, which would say that agencies and government departments need to coordinate in order to provide a seamless support for these young people in order to make that transition. That is me finished. I've kind of done a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully I haven't gone too fast for you. I'd just like to make some acknowledgements, particularly the young people from the special schools who were a joy to work with, their staff and their parents, WALK Peer themselves, my colleague, Dr. Alison Doyle. You can access the full report if you just click on the link there in the presentation, and you can contact me there for any future or any further information you might like about the research, and I'm happy to take some questions if that's okay. Thank you.
Hey, Ger, thanks very much for that. Again, another fascinating presentation. Now, there's an awful lot of questions here in the chat, so I'm going to try and cut it down to one big question. People are kind of asking stuff, Geraldine, around things like the systems approach, how government should look at it. What's the, what are the difficulties with transition, and the fact that you're talking about urban areas, rural areas, and generally then the final kind of aspect of all these questions, which I'm kind of mixing into one, is they're saying, what should business people be doing to support people in work? So the questions are very, very broad, basically asking you, what do systems need to change on all levels in society as well as in the school?
Okay, so I was just really fortunate at the time that the comprehensive strategy had been developed. And as you can see from the presentation, we have been able to map the model of supported transition onto that strategy. As a result of that, we were invited into government to present our findings, particularly to the special education agencies and also to disability agencies. And as a result of that, then we were invited to participate in a task force, which basically brings all of the stakeholders, not the young people themselves, we're the voice there to some regard, but also other colleagues like Walk Peer and other organisations in Ireland who are the voice of people with disabilities, to get them at the table. And unfortunately, and really the point of this is to bring everybody together in order to make sure that the principles within the convention is aligned with the development of policy in Ireland. And that is really leading us down to the road of independent living, which is core. But if we are to allow young people to develop those essential skills to live independently, well, then we have to include them in society. And this is where the whole notion of transition comes into play, and why I suppose that bridge of support is so important. There is nobody in Ireland takes responsibility for that. It is completely fragmented, and the comprehensive employment strategy is supposed to join all that up. Unfortunately, with COVID at the moment, it has gone on the back burner, but we will still keep moving towards that. I think possibly the most shocking thing for me in all of this is that we have a huge cohort of people, not only young people, as we all know, but people in Ireland who do not have choice and autonomy over the way they live their lives. And if anything that this model shows is that given the skills that they can have that autonomy to conduct their lives and to live independently eventually. So that's where we hope that the strategy will move to eventually, but we'll wait and see.
Sure, listen, thank you so much for that. And unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but I'm going to hand back to Tobias just to draw the overall webinar to a close. So I'll hand you back to Tobias now.
Thank you, Deirdre, and thank you to all presenters. I think we heard stunning accounts of experiences of students with intellectual disabilities in the context of inclusive education from 3 different countries. I think we learn from these fascinating approaches, which reduced barriers in research, that successfully removed barriers in research, ranging from regular designs to creative mixed methods designs up to inclusive research, in which persons with intellectual disabilities participated as researchers. When we are looking at the results, I think it is striking to see that some common themes emerge. For example, instruction that is focused on the so-called regular students, ignoring the needs and abilities of students with intellectual disabilities. But also stories of friendships and belonging, but as well stories from marginalization and exclusion in settings that are intended to be inclusive. What is also common, I think, when we look at the results, is that there are huge gaps between policies and practice. What is the most important thing, so in relation to this, is that we can learn from the various accounts of students with intellectual disabilities quite a lot. Well, I think the most important lesson is that it is key to listen to intellectual disabilities, as these accounts inform us what is going on under the surface of ostensible inclusive schools and what needs to be changed to make inclusive education a reality. These accounts inform us about the aspirations and wishes and what is helpful and what is not. Thus, this is a key message to policymakers, practitioners, and researchers from around the globe. It is key to include the voices of students with intellectual disabilities in research and policy processes. Thank you. Back to you, Deirdre.
Thanks, Tobias. So again, thanks everybody for joining our webinar today. I just want to mention this, this webinar was hosted by the Inclusive Education CERG, which is a special interest research group in IACID, and that one of the publications, we've had a recent special issue of the Journal of Policy and Practice in Intellectual Disabilities, which is actually going to be out this week. And just for those of you that are interested in these type of webinars, we would really like to welcome you to join our Inclusive Education Surrogate IACID, and you know, get involved in our roundtables and conferences over the time. There is we do plan on having more webinars, but we would like to we've had a lot of people across the 3 webinars. So we'd really appreciate your ideas, your opinions for future webinars, and we will try our best to meet those requirements. And we're hoping to plan another webinar in the spring. And just to mention that there is the 6th IACID European Congress is happening in Amsterdam between the 6th and the 8th of July. Now the call for abstracts has closed, however registration is open, and we'd like to welcome anybody who's interested in finding out more about IACID to go to the IACID website. And the presentation from today and the slides and also the recording will be available on the website shortly. And just finally, I want to thank our 3 fantastic presenters. Absolutely, as always, were brilliant. We do want to mention Ivan and Angela from IACID Academy, who are also supporting this webinar, and Jennifer Sarconi, who's the secretary of IACID, not forgetting Nikki Mallard, who's based in Tasmania, and who's the one who did all the registrations for us. And finally, Donna Corby, who did the webinar administration. So once again, thank you, everybody. Another great webinar, and we hope to see you all again at our next webinar. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.